The Galactic Council had a simple rule: Class 12 Deathworlds were quarantine zones. No ship was to approach within 3 light years. No probe was to be sent. No communication was to be attempted. These worlds were where evolution had gone mad, where every organism was designed to kill, where the very atmosphere could dissolve bones and the gravity could crush civilized beings into paste. So when the emergency beacon started transmitting from Kepler 442b, a Class 12 nightmare that made veteran xenobiologists weep, the Council faced an impossible choice. A diplomatic vessel carrying representatives from 12 species had crashed there during a routine hyperspace jump gone wrong. The most advanced rescue technologies in the galaxy couldn't penetrate the world's deadly electromagnetic storms. The most sophisticated environmental suits would fail within hours against the corrosive atmosphere and predatory ecosystem. Every simulation ended the same way: total mission failure and the loss of all rescue personnel. That's when someone mentioned the humans. "They're from a Class 10 world," Admiral Vexai said dismissively, his forearms gesturing at the holographic display of Kepler 442b's hellish surface. "Surely even they wouldn't be foolish enough to actually," interrupted Dr. Sarah Chen, the human representative, studying the data with disturbing calm. "This looks like it might be a fun weekend camping trip. When do we leave?" The silence that followed would become legendary in diplomatic circles. Because what the galaxy was about to learn was that humans didn't see Deathworlds as obstacles to overcome. They saw them as home. The rescue briefing aboard the Galactic Council vessel Harmony should have been a somber affair. Representatives from 12 different species sat around the circular table, their various appendages, tentacles, and sensory organs all focused on the holographic display of Kepler 442b. The planet rotated slowly, its sickly green atmosphere swirling with perpetual storms that registered electromagnetic readings off every known scale. Admiral Vexai, a Kethmiran whose blue-scaled hide had turned pale with stress, manipulated the display with precise movements of his forearms. "The diplomatic vessel Concordance crashed here approximately 72 standard hours ago," he began, his translator rendering his clicks and whistles into flat, emotionless common tongue. "Initial telemetry suggests the ship suffered catastrophic hyperdrive failure during routine transit." Dr. Yulnara, the expedition's chief xenobiologist, extended her crystalline sensory array toward the display. Her species, the Sylphani, were renowned throughout the galaxy for their ability to analyze biological threats. The readings made her entire translucent body pulse with distress colors. "Class 12 designation confirmed," she announced, her melodic voice carrying undertones of fear. "Atmospheric composition includes sulfuric acid vapor concentrations at 40%. Surface temperature variations between -60 and +180 degrees Celsius. Gravitational field fluctuates between 2.3 and 2.8 standard gravities due to the planet's unstable core." A collective shudder ran through the assembled beings. Even the Mordaki representative, whose species evolved in high radiation environments, seemed visibly disturbed by the data. "The electromagnetic storms make orbital approach impossible," continued Admiral Vexai. "Our most advanced shielding systems would fail within minutes of entering the outer atmosphere. Surface scans are limited, but we've identified what appears to be the crash site in a region the computer has designated as maximally hostile to all known forms of life." Captain Zorthi, whose people had colonized gas giants, raised a tentacled appendage. "What about our survivors? Any communication?" "Intermittent emergency beacon signals suggest at least some survived the initial crash," Dr. Yilnara replied. "However, our biological models indicate that even with the Concordance's emergency life support systems, they have perhaps 48 hours before the environment becomes unsurvivable." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a shroud. 48 hours to mount a rescue operation to the most dangerous world any of them had encountered. The mathematics were simple and brutal: it couldn't be done. "Perhaps," Admiral Vexai said quietly, "we should begin preparing memorial services for." "Actually," interrupted a voice from the back of the room, "this looks like it might be a fun weekend camping trip." Every head, sensor array, and optical organ turned toward the speaker. Dr. Sarachin sat casually in her chair, feet propped up on the table, studying the planetary data on her tablet with the same expression most beings reserved for checking the weather. Her companion, Major Jake Rodriguez, was leaning back with his arms folded, nodding approvingly at something on his own display. "I'm sorry," Admiral Vexai said slowly, his translator struggling with the concept of fun in this context. "Did you just describe a Class 12 Deathworld as recreational?" Sarah looked up from her tablet, brown eyes bright with what the other species would later learn to recognize as dangerous human enthusiasm. "Well, I mean, it's no Australia, but it looks challenging enough. Jake, what do you think about the acid rain situation?" Jake shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying both dismissal and professional assessment. "Dealt with worse in the Amazon during monsoon season. Plus, remember that time in Siberia when the temperature dropped to -70 and the local wildlife included those radioactive bears?" Point, Sarah conceded. "Though I have to admit, the gravity fluctuations are interesting. Might make hiking a bit more challenging." Dr. Yilnara's sensory array practically vibrated with disbelief. "You do understand that this planet has been classified as unsurvivable? The atmospheric composition alone would dissolve most known materials within hours." "Most known materials, sure," Sarah said, pulling up environmental specs on her tablet. "But we've got some decent gear. Standard issue environmental suits should hold up for a while, and we can improvise protective equipment from local materials if needed." "Local materials?" Captain Zorthi's voice rose several octaves. "The scan data indicates that the indigenous plant life produces toxins that can penetrate molecular-level filtration systems. That's why you don't rely on filtration systems," Jake said matter-of-factly. "You adapt to the environment instead of fighting it. Basic survival training." Admiral Vexai's forearms moved in what his species considered a gesture of profound confusion. "I'm afraid I don't understand. Your home planet, Earth, is classified as Class 10. Surely you cannot be suggesting that your experience there would be sufficient for Class 10? Sarah interrupted, looking genuinely puzzled. "Who classified Earth as Class 10? "The Galactic Survey Corps conducted a comprehensive analysis during first contact protocols," Dr. Yilnara explained. "Your world contains numerous hostile environmental zones, predatory megafauna, seismic instability, extreme weather patterns, and over 60 different ways that the local biology can kill most galactic species. Class 10 was considered generous." Sarah and Jake exchanged glances and burst into laughter. The sound was alien to most of the species present, but somehow more disturbing than any threat display they'd encountered. "Class 10? Jake managed between chuckles. "That's adorable. What did you guys make of the deep ocean zones? Or the polar regions? Did anyone mention the desert ecosystems? Or Australia?" Sarah added helpfully. "Because if Earth only rates Class 10 with Australia on it, your classification system might need some recalibration." Dr. Yilnara's entire body shifted to colors that didn't translate well but generally indicated severe distress. "You're suggesting that your homeworld is more dangerous than our surveys indicated?" "Not more dangerous," Sarah corrected, standing and walking over to the holographic display of Kepler 442b. "Just normal." "This place?" She gestured at the swirling storms and hostile readings. "This is Tuesday for humans. We've got environments like this all over Earth. Hell, people pay money to vacation in places almost this dangerous." She began manipulating the display, zooming in on various surface features. "Sulfuric acid atmosphere? We've got volcanic regions that'll cook you in minutes and poison you with every breath. Temperature extremes? Try spending winter in Space Russia or summer in Death Valley. Unstable gravity? Okay, that one's new, but the principle's the same as dealing with avalanche zones or tidal forces." "The electromagnetic storms," Admiral Vexai began. "Solar flares and magnetic pole shifts," Jake interrupted. "We've been dealing with electromagnetic interference since we figured out how to make radios. You adapt your equipment and plan around it. The predatory ecosystem. Have you ever been hunting with a pack of human teenagers?" Sarah asked seriously. "Because I guarantee you they're more dangerous than whatever's down there." The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of the ship's life support systems. Finally, Captain Zorthi spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. You're volunteering for this mission. Volunteering? Sarah looked genuinely confused. I thought this was why you called us. Isn't this exactly the sort of thing humans do? What sort of thing? Dr. Yilnara asked, her colors shifting to patterns that suggested she was afraid of the answer. Going places that are supposed to be impossible to survive and bringing people home, Jake said simply. It's kind of our thing. Admiral Vexhi's scales had shifted to a deep purple that indicated either profound respect or absolute terror. You would attempt this rescue with standard equipment? No specialized gear? No extensive preparation time? Sarah checked her watch. How long until we can get a shuttle prepped? Because if we're doing this, we should probably get moving. Every hour we spend talking is an hour those survivors don't have. Dr. Chen, Admiral Vexhi said carefully, I must emphasize that our computer models indicate a 0% probability of mission success. 0% probability of survival for any rescue team. This is not a matter of courage or determination. This is mathematics. Sarah smiled, and every non-human in the room felt a primitive shiver of recognition. It was the smile of a persistence predator that had just spotted prey. Admiral, with all due respect, your computer models have never met humans before. And the one thing we're really good at is proving that impossible just means nobody's tried hard enough yet. She turned back to the display, studying the swirling chaos of Kepler 442b with the focused attention of a hunter examining tracks. Jake, what's our drop window looking like? Jake was already pulling up orbital mechanics on his display. Storm systems have a regular pattern. Looks like we get a 40-minute window of reduced electromagnetic interference every 6 hours. Next window opens in 3 hours, 17 minutes. Perfect. That gives us time to prep gear and brief the rescue protocols. Sarah turned back to the assembled aliens. We'll need a shuttle that can handle atmospheric entry, basic survival equipment, and someone to monitor communications from orbit. Standard search and rescue operation. Dr. Yilnara's voice was barely audible. Standard? Well, Sarah admitted, maybe slightly above standard. But not by much. As the briefing dissolved into frantic preparations, Admiral Vexhi found himself staring at the two humans with something approaching awe. They moved with the casual efficiency of beings preparing for a routine task, checking equipment and discussing contingencies with the same tone others might use to plan a grocery shopping trip. It occurred to him that the Galactic Council might have made a serious error in their assessment of humanity. Not in underestimating their capabilities, but in fundamentally misunderstanding what those capabilities meant. Humans, he realized, didn't see Kepler 442b as an impossible challenge. They saw it as just another day at the office. The shuttle bay of the Harmony had become a circus of alien panic and human preparation. Dr. Sarah Chan and Major Jake Rodriguez moved through their equipment checks with practiced efficiency while representatives from 12 species watched in fascinated horror. Environmental suit integrity, check, Sarah called out, running her hands over the seals of what looked to the observers like impossibly thin protective gear. Emergency oxygen reserves, check. Basic toolkit, check. Jake was loading what appeared to be an inadequate collection of supplies into a standard issue pack. Rope, check. Emergency rations for 72 hours, check. First aid supplies, check. Emergency beacon, check. Admiral Vexhi approached hesitantly, his forearms carrying a collection of advanced Galactic Council survival equipment. Dr. Chen, surely you'll want to take our atmospheric processors? Our molecular level protective shields? Our emergency teleportation devices? Sarah glanced at the offered equipment and shook her head politely. Thanks, but that stuff's not really built for Class 12 environments. Too many failure points. We'll stick with simple, reliable gear. Simple? Dr. Yilnara's colors shifted to patterns indicating profound confusion. Your equipment appears to be primitive. Primitive works, Jake explained, hefting a coil of what looked like ordinary rope. Complex systems fail in hostile environments. Simple systems adapt. Captain Zorthy extended a tentacle toward Sarah's environmental suit. This appears to be standard atmospheric protection gear. Surely it cannot withstand the corrosive effects of "it'll hold up long enough," Sarah said confidently. "And, when it doesn't, we'll improvise." The word improvise sent visible shudders through several of the alien observers. To most galactic species, improvisation in life or death situations was a terrifying concept. Survival was a matter of careful planning, extensive preparation, and foolproof equipment. Engineer Colvass, whose people had built some of the most advanced technology in the galaxy, studied the human equipment with growing horror. "Your emergency beacon has a range of only 50 kilometers in optimal conditions. In electromagnetic storm conditions, perhaps 10 kilometers. Then, we'll get within 10 kilometers of the crash site," Jake said simply. "Your food supplies will last 72 hours. Our calculations suggest the mission could require up to 2 weeks. Then, we'll find food planetside," Sarah added, checking the seals on her pack. "The indigenous plant and animal life is toxic to all known forms of life." Sarah and Jake exchanged glances. "Define all known forms of life," Sarah said carefully. Dr. Yulnara consulted her datapad nervously. The survey included biological samples from over 400 species across the galaxy. "The planet's ecosystem produces compounds that are universally toxic." "Universally toxic to the 400 species you tested," Jake corrected. "Humans weren't on that list." "Surely you can't be suggesting that you could digest indigenous food sources without preparation, without analysis, without people have been eating random stuff they found in the woods for millions of years," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "It's how we figured out which mushrooms were good and which ones would kill you. Trial and error." Engineer Colvass made a sound that his translator rendered as acute distress. "Trial and error? With potentially fatal substances?" "Well, yeah. That's how you learn what's safe." Sarah looked genuinely puzzled by their reaction. "How else would you do it?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Because the truth was, no other galactic species learned that way. They analyzed. They tested. They built comprehensive databases and safety protocols. They did not simply eat random alien plants to see what happened. Commander Yathera, whose people were renowned for their strategic planning abilities, stepped forward. "Dr. Chen, Major Rodriguez, I must ask, what is your primary mission objective?" "Extract the survivors from the crash site," Jake replied immediately. "And your secondary objectives?" Sarah shrugged. "Don't die, I guess. But that's more of a guideline than a requirement." The silence that followed was deafening. Every alien in the shuttle bay tried to process what they had just heard. For galactic species, "don't die" wasn't a guideline. It was the first, second, and third priority in any dangerous situation. Admiral Vexai finally found his voice. "You're suggesting that mission success takes priority over survival?" "Not suggesting," Jake corrected. "Stating. We don't abandon people. Ever. That's not negotiable." Dr. Yulnara's colors shifted to patterns that indicated she was trying to understand an alien psychology. "But, if you die attempting rescue, you cannot help anyone." "If we don't try because it's dangerous, they die anyway," Sarah pointed out. "At least this way, they have a chance." The loading bay fell silent except for the hum of machinery and the distant vibration of the ship's engines. The assembled aliens were confronting a fundamental difference in thinking that challenged everything they understood about rational behavior. "Final equipment check," Sarah announced, hefting her pack. The total weight of her gear appeared to be less than what most species would consider adequate for a pleasant afternoon outing, let alone a rescue mission to the most dangerous planet any of them had encountered. Jake was running through a mental checklist, his expression focused but not worried. Insertion point coordinates locked in. Emergency extraction beacon configured. Backup communication protocols established. "What's the weather looking like?" Sarah asked, as if she were planning a picnic rather than dropping into a hellscape. Jake consulted his tablet. "Storm systems moving in standard patterns. Surface winds currently at 80 kilometers per hour, gusting to 120. Acid precipitation moderate to heavy. Temperature at insertion point is actually not too bad. Only minus 43 Celsius. Balmy, Sarah commented approvingly. Engineer Cole Vass made another distressed noise. Those conditions would be immediately fatal to every species represented here. Sure, if you're not prepared for them, Jake agreed. But, we've worked in similar conditions before. Where? Demanded Captain Zorthy. Where in the galaxy have you encountered similar environments? Sarah counted on her fingers. Antarctica, northern Canada, Siberia, the Gobi Desert, the deep Amazon, active volcanic regions, several ocean trenches. Honestly, most of Earth has at least one of these conditions at any given time. Your homeworld contains multiple regions with Class 12 environmental conditions? Dr. Yilnara asked faintly. Class 12, Class 15, probably some stuff that would rate higher if you knew about it, Sarah confirmed. The thing about humans is, we didn't evolve to survive in one specific environment. We evolved to survive everywhere. Admiral Vexhi's scales had shifted to deep purple again. Every galactic species evolved to fill a specific ecological niche. Desert worlds, ocean worlds, high-gravity worlds, low-atmosphere worlds. But, Earth doesn't have a niche, Jake finished. It has everything. Deserts, oceans, mountains, forests, polar ice, volcanic activity, massive weather systems, seismic activity. If you want to survive as a human, you have to be able to handle all of it. The shuttle pilot, a nervous Veltani named Siskara, emerged from the cockpit looking pale around her gill slits. Insertion window opens in 15 minutes. I must inform you that the electromagnetic interference is significant. I can get you down, but extraction will depend entirely on you reaching the emergency beacon coordinates. Understood, Sarah said, shouldering her pack. What's the distance from insertion point to crash site? Approximately 47 kilometers through what our sensors identify as maximally hostile terrain. Jake nodded approvingly. Nice. A good day's hike. A day's hike? Engineer Kolvas's voice rose several octaves. Through corrosive atmosphere, unstable gravity, and hostile ecosystem? 47 kilometers is about 8 hours at standard pace, Sarah explained patiently. Call it 10 hours to account for terrain and environmental factors. We should be at the crash site by local evening. Dr. Yilnara was frantically consulting her biological models. Our computer simulations suggest that the local predator species could detect your presence from several kilometers away. The pheromone traces alone would trigger feeding responses from every carnivorous organism in the region. Sarah brightened visibly. Really? That's actually helpful. Predators means there's a functioning food chain, which means some of the local biology is probably edible. Thanks for the heads up. The concept that local predators represented a food source rather than a mortal threat seemed to break something fundamental in Dr. Yilnara's worldview. Her colors shifted to patterns that her translator couldn't properly render. 5 minutes to insertion window, called Siskara from the cockpit. Sarah and Jake moved toward the shuttle with the casual efficiency of people heading to work. As they strapped themselves into the insertion seats, Sarah looked back at the assembled aliens. Don't worry about us, she said cheerfully. We'll have those survivors back before you know it. This is what humans do. Admiral Vexhi watched them through the shuttle viewport as Siskara began the departure sequence. 2 members of a species that the Galactic Council had significantly underestimated, heading into conditions that computer models declared unsurvivable, with equipment that seemed inadequate and an attitude that suggested they were looking forward to the challenge. As the shuttle disappeared into the swirling chaos of Kepler 442b's atmosphere, he made a mental note to request a complete reassessment of Earth's classification. Because if this was what Class 10 humans could do, he was beginning to suspect that the galaxy had no idea what they were dealing with. The surface of Kepler 442b was exactly as advertised, absolutely trying to kill everything that moved. Sarah Chen felt the corrosive atmosphere eating at her environmental suit's outer layer as she and Jake Rodriguez emerged from the crashed shuttle's emergency pod. The electromagnetic storm had made their landing rougher than planned, but they were alive and within walking distance of their target. Suit integrity at 85%, Jake reported, checking his readings. Acid levels are higher than predicted, but we've got enough protection for the timeline. Sarah nodded, shouldering her pack and checking her compass. The magnetic interference played hell with electronic navigation, but she'd learned celestial navigation as a child and the basic principles worked on any planet with a visible star. Crash site bearing is 270 degrees. Distance approximately 43 kilometers after the navigation error. Around them, the landscape writhed with what could charitably be called life. Twisted trees with metallic bark grew in impossible spirals, their leaves dripping with substances that glowed faintly green in the perpetual twilight. Strange creatures moved through the undergrowth, their calls echoing weirdly through the dense atmosphere. Jake knelt beside one of the local plants, studying its structure with professional interest. pH levels would dissolve most organic compounds on contact, but the local adaptation is fascinating. The plant matter has developed a kind of biometallic coating. Edible? Sarah asked practically. Give me a few samples to test as we move. Basic field analysis should tell us what's safe. He carefully collected specimens in sealed containers, treating the deadly alien ecosystem like a particularly interesting botanical garden. They began walking toward the crash site, their pace steady but unhurried. The gravity fluctuations that had terrified the galactic observers proved to be more interesting than dangerous. When the field strengthened, they leaned into it like hikers ascending a steep trail. When it weakened, they adjusted their stride to avoid bouncing too high. It's like walking on a trampoline that keeps changing how bouncy it is, Sarah observed, adapting her gait as the gravity shifted from 2.1 to 2.6 standard gravities. You just have to pay attention to the rhythm. The first local predator found them about an hour into their hike. It was roughly the size of a large bear, covered in crystalline spines that refracted the sickly light into rainbow patterns. Its 6 legs moved in an undulating pattern that should have been beautiful if the creature hadn't been obviously designed for killing. Jake noticed it first, tracking their movement from about 50 meters away through the twisted vegetation. Company, he said quietly, not breaking stride. Sarah glanced in the indicated direction and spotted the creature. Territorial or hungry? Testing us, I think. Classic predator behavior. It's trying to figure out if we're prey or competition. The creature began to pace them, staying just at the edge of vision. Its movements were fluid despite its size, and the way it navigated the unstable gravity suggested it was perfectly adapted to the local conditions. Should we be worried? Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly concerned. Not unless it brings friends. Solo predators usually don't attack unless they're sure they can win. Jake kept walking but shifted his pack slightly, making sure he had quick access to his emergency tools. Besides, if it survived in this environment, it's probably smart enough to recognize that we're not normal prey. He was right. The creature followed them for another kilometer before apparently deciding they weren't worth the risk. It melted back into the undergrowth with barely a sound, leaving only the faintest trace of its passing. Smart animal, Sarah commented approvingly. I like ecosystems where the predators use their brains. They continued walking through the ever-changing landscape. The acid rain that had terrified the galactic observers turned out to be manageable with proper technique. They found natural overhangs and cave formations that provided temporary shelter, and Jake's field analysis of the local plant life had identified several species that were not only non-toxic to humans but actually nutritious. The crystalline fruit from those spiral trees has about the same nutritional profile as apples, he reported, offering Sarah a sample that glowed faintly blue. Higher mineral content, but perfectly digestible. Sarah bit into the alien fruit thoughtfully. Tastes like a cross between an apple and a battery. Not bad, actually. The temperature variations that would have killed most galactic species were handled with basic layering techniques and awareness of wind patterns. When the temperature dropped to -50, they put on additional insulation and kept moving to maintain body heat. When it spiked to +40, they found shade and adjusted their water consumption. The key, Jake explained to no one in particular, is not fighting the environment. You work with it. Temperature goes up, you adapt. Gravity changes, you adapt. Predators show up, you adapt. It's all just data. They reached the first major obstacle about 6 hours into their hike, a chasm nearly 200 meters wide, carved by rivers of acid that continued to eat away at the rock formations. The electromagnetic interference made their equipment readings unreliable, but Sarah's examination of the terrain suggested the depth was significant. Looks like our navigation was off, she said, studying the obstacle. This wasn't on the survey maps. Jake was already examining the chasm walls, looking for climbing routes. Recent formation, probably. The seismic activity here would create new geological features regularly. He pointed to a series of natural ledges and outcroppings. It's climbable, but it'll add time to our schedule. How much time? 3, maybe 4 hours to get across safely. But we'll be exposed during the crossing, and there's weather coming in. Sarah looked at the approaching storm front, a wall of green-tinged clouds that flickered with electrical discharge. How exposed? Very. No shelter, no escape routes once we start the crossing. If that storm hits while we're on the wall, the electromagnetic interference will be the least of our problems. Sarah considered their options. They could wait for the storm to pass, but that would cost them precious time that the survivors might not have. They could attempt to find an alternate route, but the terrain analysis suggested this was likely the most navigable crossing point for kilometers in either direction. What's our survival probability if we get caught in the storm during the crossing? She asked. Jake studied the approaching weather system and the climbing route. Honestly? Maybe 30%. The electrical discharge alone would probably kill most people, and that's assuming the acid precipitation doesn't compromise our handholds. Sarah nodded and began checking her climbing gear. 30%'s not bad odds. Let's get moving. Jake grinned, recognizing the tone. It was the voice humans used when they decided that impossible odds simply meant they had to be more creative about succeeding. I was hoping you'd say that. They began the crossing with practiced efficiency. The rock face was treacherous, made slippery by constant acid precipitation and weakened by the planet's seismic activity. But both humans had extensive climbing experience in hostile conditions, and they moved with the careful speed of people who understood that falling was not an option. Halfway across, the storm hit. The electromagnetic discharge turned the air around them into a crackling web of energy that made their hair stand on end and played havoc with their equipment. The acid precipitation increased to levels that would have dissolved most metals, and the wind gusts threatened to tear them from the rock face. This is officially unpleasant, Sarah called over the howling wind, her voice barely audible despite the communication system. Still better than that storm in Nepal, Jake replied, finding handholds that shouldn't have existed and somehow making progress despite conditions that should have made movement impossible. They climbed through weather that would have grounded aircraft and killed most life forms, moving with the methodical persistence of humans who had long ago learned that nature was not malicious, merely indifferent. The storm didn't want to kill them, it simply didn't care whether they lived or died. That indifference was something humans understood perfectly. 2 hours later, they emerged from the chasm on the far side, their environmental suits significantly degraded but still functional. The storm was moving away, leaving behind the familiar hellscape of Kepler 442b's normal weather patterns. Suit integrity at 40%, Jake reported. But we're within emergency beacon range of the crash site. Sarah activated her scanner and immediately picked up the signal they'd been hoping for. Survivor beacon, bearing 315 degrees, distance 8 kilometers. Strong signal strength suggests multiple survivors. They covered the remaining distance in just under 2 hours, moving through terrain that became increasingly unstable as they approached the impact site. The Concordance had carved a scar through the landscape that was visible from several kilometers away, and the wreckage itself was scattered across nearly a square kilometer of devastation. But, as they approached the largest section of intact hull, they could hear something that made them both smile, voices. Alien voices, speaking in multiple languages, but definitely alive and apparently organizing some kind of activity. Survivors confirmed, Sarah reported into her emergency beacon. Moving to establish contact. They found the survivors in a jury-rigged shelter constructed from pieces of the Concordance's hull and emergency equipment. 12 beings from 8 different species had managed to create a functional life support environment using salvaged materials and what appeared to be considerable ingenuity. The reception they received was not what they expected. Humans? Ambassador Kithmar, a Veltani diplomat, emerged from the shelter wearing a makeshift environmental suit that had clearly been cobbled together from spare parts. "What are you doing here?" "Rescuing you," Jake said simply. "Are there injuries?" "How many survivors total?" 12 survivors, various minor injuries, but Ambassador Kithmar looked around at the hellish landscape. "How did you get here?" "The Galactic Council said rescue was impossible due to the environmental conditions." Sarah and Jake exchanged glances. "We walked," Sarah said. The explanation of their journey took several minutes, during which the survivors displayed expressions that ranged from disbelief to outright horror. The idea that 2 humans had simply hiked across 43 kilometers of Class 12 Deathworld conditions seemed to challenge their understanding of what was possible. "You climbed across the acid chasm during an electromagnetic storm?" Dr. Felnara, a Silfani scientist, asked faintly. "It seemed like the most direct route," Jake explained reasonably. "You've been eating the local plant life?" Engineer Volkas, a Kethmiran, gestured at Jake's sample containers. The survey data indicated universal toxicity. "Universal to the species they tested," Sarah corrected. "Humans have different biochemistry. Plus, field testing protocols let you identify edible versus non-edible pretty quickly." The survivors continued asking questions about the rescue journey, and it gradually became clear to Sarah and Jake that these weren't expressions of relief or gratitude. They were expressions of scientific curiosity mixed with something approaching fear. Finally, Ambassador Kithmar asked the question that was apparently on everyone's mind: "Are all humans like this?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Like what?" "Capable of this." The ambassador gestured at the hostile environment around them. "Treating impossible survival conditions as merely inconvenient." Sarah and Jake looked at each other, then back at the assembled survivors. The truth was, this had been a fairly routine rescue operation by human standards. Challenging terrain, hostile environment, time pressure, no backup support. It was the kind of situation that humans encountered regularly and had developed standard procedures for handling. "Pretty much," Jake said finally. "I mean, this is what we do. Someone's in trouble, you go get them. The environment doesn't really matter." The silence that followed would be remembered by every survivor for the rest of their lives. Because in that moment, they understood something about humanity that would reshape how the galaxy viewed Earth's children. Humans didn't overcome hostile environments through superior technology or careful planning or advanced preparation. They overcame hostile environments by being more hostile than the environment itself. 3 hours later, as the rescue shuttle lifted off with all survivors safely aboard, Admiral Vexhai received a priority communication from the surface. "Rescue complete," Sarah reported cheerfully. All 12 survivors accounted for, minor injuries only, no casualties. "Ready for pickup at extraction coordinates." Admiral Vexhai stared at the communication display for a long moment. "Dr. Chen, please confirm, you successfully crossed 43 kilometers of Class 12 terrain, survived an electromagnetic storm during a vertical rock face crossing, established contact with survivors, and organized successful extraction, all within mission timeline parameters?" "Actually, we're about 2 hours ahead of schedule," Sarah replied. "The terrain was less challenging than expected once you understood the local patterns." "Oh, and Jake's identified several local food sources that are not only safe for human consumption but actually quite nutritious. If anyone's interested in expanding the galactic dietary database." In the background, Admiral Vexhai could hear one of the survivors saying something in a shaky voice about humans being terrifyingly casual about impossible odds. As the shuttle docked and the survivors were helped aboard to immediate medical attention, Admiral Vexhai made a decision that would change galactic policy forever. Earth's classification was being upgraded immediately. Not because it was more dangerous than they thought, but because its inhabitants were far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. And the galaxy was going to have to adjust its understanding of what humans considered inconvenient.